In today's video, Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, he's facing off versus longtime rival in blitz chess, Daniel Naroditsky, and what a game they played. In the game, Magnus here, playing as black, opens with the French defense, a very combative option, but things really heat up on move 21 when Magnus sacks the rook on the f3 square, blowing open the kingside in the spirit of Mikhail Tal himself and launching a brutal kingside attack. Trust me, you don't want to miss the shocking twist ending to this game. Alright, in the game here, Daniel, playing as white, opens 1e4, best by test, and Magnus, how does he respond? He responds with the French defense, a very combative option. Now here, of course, d4 is the standard move for white, trying to control the center, but instead, Daniel, on move 2, he plays the move knight to f3. What does he have in mind for this game? Knight f3 is almost never played here by white. Alright, Magnus, he continues, d5. The standard French defense response, trying to occupy the center on d5. And now, Daniel, what is his big idea? Will he trade on d4 or on d5? Will he go d4 himself? What is the plan? Well, here, Daniel goes e5, gaining space in the center in the spirit of the advanced variation of the French defense. But here, there's no pawn on d4. In the advanced variation, white always has that pawn on d4, which controls the center, supports e5, and so on. And here, Magnus, he punishes this mistake by playing the move c5, gaining space himself and controlling d4. Now, d4 is so much harder to achieve, as if white does play that move, black can simply capture on d4, like this, d4 and then c takes, absolutely ruining white's pawn structure and making e5 that much harder to defend later in the game. Now, instead of that here, Daniel, he plays the move c3, which makes a lot of sense, threatening d4 on the next move. But here, because white did not go d4 yet, Magnus has the option of going d4 himself, gaining space in the center and making it almost impossible for white to ever go d4 in the future. That would have been a very, very strong response. Now, instead, in the game, Magnus here, he sort of lets Daniel off the hook a little bit, and he plays the move knight to c6. Now, this move here allows white to go d4 himself if he wants to, and Daniel does play the move. d4, here we go, back to the main line of the advanced variation of the French defense. Now here, black's got several different ways to proceed. He can go, for example, bishop d7, or queen b6, or knight gd7. There were a lot of very playable ideas here for black, but in the game, black plays the absolute main line, simply bishop d7, developing the bishop, controlling this diagonal, and setting up rook to c8 ideas later in the game. This is by far the main move here, and the strongest one for black. Now, Daniel, he's got to find some way to develop and castle his king on the king side as soon as possible, and therefore, for that reason, bishop e2 and bishop d3 make the most sense by far here, and white does go bishop e2, setting up short castles. Now, here, in this position, on move 6, Magnus Carlsen, if I do say so myself, he makes a slightly dubious move. He actually takes on d4, c takes d4 is the move. Now, why do I say this is a little bit dubious? The problem with this move is after c takes, suddenly, white has the option of playing knight c3 in one go, bringing the knight out to a very, very strong square. The reason why this move here is dubious is, in this position, the knight on b1 does not have access to c3, and that is to Carlsen's benefit. Instead, when you take on d4, you give white the added option of simply knight c3, bringing the piece to a very, very strong square. Now, Magnus continues, knight gd7, developing his kingside and threatening knight to f5, pressuring d4, a very logical idea. And now Daniel, instead of knight c3, that would be the strongest move. Instead of that, he plays the move knight to a3. Daniel, what on earth are you doing with this move? Don't worry, Daniel has not lost his mind. He's got a very concrete idea in mind, as we'll see on the very next move. Alright, Magnus, knight to f5 is the move, pressuring d4 with those two knights on c6 and f5. And now Daniel, he shows the idea. His move is knight to c2, retreating his knight to a very good defensive square on c2 where it does bolster the d4 pawn. Alright, Magnus, bishop e7, setting up short castles, and here both sides do castle. We have castles and then castles. So far, both sides have finished most of their development. The opening is basically over, and the middle game has begun. Alright, in this middle game, Daniel here, he's got the space advantage on the king side, and that means most likely he will want to attack on that side of the board. Meanwhile, Magnus, the d4 pawn is very, very weak. He'll try to attack it with everything he's got, and beyond that, the f6 break may be one idea later in the middle game. All right, Daniel here. he continues. Bishop d3, pressuring the weak knight on f5. Of course, he had many other options. For example, king to h1, setting up g4 is strong. Also, bishop f4. Simply bringing out one more piece would also be very good, but instead, bishop d3 played in the game, threatening taking on f5 with the bishop. Now here, Magnus, he finds the strongest move and a very standard idea in the French defense in general, and that is the move f6, the good old-fashioned Ben Feingold counterattack, threatening capturing on e5, threatening to open up the f-file for the rook, and obviously weakening white's pawn structure in the process. Now, Daniel, how does he want to continue? In the game, he plays the move rook to e1, which looks extremely logical, but it turns out this was not the right way to proceed. Instead, taking on f5 or bolstering e5 with the bishop would have been a lot stronger. Instead, rook e1 played in the game, occupying the soon-to-be open e-file with the rook, but here black takes on e5, white takes back, and suddenly this pawn on the e5 square is actually more of a liability than an asset. And beyond that, Magnus here, with the rook on the f8 square, he has supreme control of the f-file, and of course black may use the f-file later in the game to launch a brutal attack on the king side, despite white having the so-called space advantage on that side of the board. Alright, now, Magnus, rook c8, a logical move, bringing the rook to the open c-file, and now, here, Daniel, he finally decides it is time to capture on the f5 square. We have bishop takes, and then rook takes, and of course, this only helps black to further activate his rook, and to be honest, here, Daniel, he's not that much worse, but already, I really like the black position in this game. Now, Daniel, the move is knight c d4, jumping up with the knight, and then rook to f8. Simply going back with the rook, back to a very safe square. Now Daniel, he continues, bishop b3, bringing out more and more of his pieces, setting up the idea of perhaps rook c1 or queen d2 and so on. And now Magnus, queen to e8, a very aggressive idea. The queen now eyes the g6 and the h5 squares. The queen may be an attacking piece in the very near future on the king side. And now here, Daniel, he's got to find some way to proceed, and this really is an absolutely critical moment in this game. And the big question is, what do you want to attack? I mean, where are the weak points in the black position? And honestly, it's not that obvious what you should be attacking here. Now, in the game, Daniel, he probably should be going, for example, queen to b3, pressuring b7, or rook c1, pressuring the c-file. Instead of that, he gets a little bit greedy, and he finds a way to win a pawn on the queen side immediately. And he does that with the move knight takes c6, removing the defender of the a7 pawn. So, he takes on c6, black takes back, and then he wins the pawn on a7. Bishop takes a7 is the move. Now, the problem with this is the bishop on a7 is now at risk of being locked out of the game, and Magnus finds the strong response immediately, as usual, and he plays the move c5. Look at this, the bishop. There, it is simply trapped on a7. It's got nowhere to go. Daniel in the game finds the strongest response, b4, giving up a pawn in the process to bring the bishop back into the game on this diagonal. Here, Magnus, he takes on b4, c takes b4, and Daniel immediately retreats back to the e3 square, bishop e3 played in the game. Now here, Magnus, in reality, he is spoiled for choice. He has so many different options to continue to pile on pressure onto the white position. For example, rook to c4 is very strong, as is rook c3. But in the game, he plays a slightly different option, simply bishop a4, pressuring the weak queen on d1 with the bishop. And now finally, the light square bishop, the problem piece for black in the French defense, is suddenly on a very active square and active diagonal. And now here, in this position, Daniel, he's got to maintain defense of the knight on f3, and therefore the best move is queen to e2, still defending the f3 knight. Instead of that, he plays the move queen d4 in this game, and this is all Magnus needs to go full Mikhail Tal. He simply sacks the rook on the f3 square, blowing open the king side. And the reason this works so well, once you take on f3 and white takes back, g takes, suddenly the g file is open, the king is exposed, and the e5 pawn is that much weaker. Magnus here, giving up the rook for the knight, simply to launch the all-out attack against the white king in the spirit of Mikhail Tal himself. All right, Magnus, rook c4 is the first follow-up, a very strong move, attacking the weak queen on d4. The queen's got to move, it's got to go somewhere, and in the game, queen b6 was chosen. The queen pressures e6, However, the queen on b6 is completely away from the defense of the king side, and therefore I'm not so sure that was the right idea. Instead, queen d3, dropping back and eyeing f1 may have been a little bit stronger. Instead, queen b6 played in the game, eyeing e6, but Magnus, he's ready. Queen g6 is the move, pressuring the king, but also defending e6 in one simple move. A very strong multi-purpose idea. Daniel, king to h1, slides the king over, and now, of course, the rook on the e1 square does have access to g1. Rook g1 could be played next, pressuring the queen on g6. Now, Magnus, queen to f5. He gets out of the way of the attack in advance, and of course, pressures the weak pawns on f3 and e5. Now, Daniel, what's it going to be? How do you respond? In the game, he plays the move rook g1, simply giving up both of these pawns. Actually, not both, but whichever pawn Magnus wants here, he can take on e5 or on f3. And it turns out taking on f3 is the best move here for black, winning the pawn, checking the king, and continuing the all-out attack. Now, instead of that, in the game, Magnus here, he plays a different idea. That is the move d4, gaining space in the center here and potentially opening up this diagonal for the bishop to retreat to pressure the white king. Now here, Daniel, queen b8 is the move, pressuring the king, missing the stronger idea, the absolutely absurd idea of rook to g3, giving up the piece on e3, but it turns out this would be the best response for very complicated reasons. And if you like puzzles, feel free to try and solve yourself why rook g3 is the right move. Instead, in the game, queen b8 was chosen by Daniel, the speed demon himself, but this move is substantially weaker, and here Magnus really starts to pull away in this game. Bishop f8 is the move, blocking the check. Now, rook g3. Daniel trying to double up rooks on the g file, intending rook a to g1 on the next move. Now here, the bishop is falling. D takes e3 is chosen, rook a to g1. Daniel pressuring g6, and Magnus, he sees this and simply goes g6, defending and opening up new diagonals for the dark squared bishop on g7 and h6. Now, here Daniel, he takes on e3, f takes e3 is the move, and then bishop c6. As promised, Magnus here finding a much better diagonal for the very important light square bishop, where he does pressure the weak pawn on f3, and of course the king behind it on the h1 square. Daniel, he sees this, he knows this, and he plays the move e4, blocking the attack of the bishop, but is it too little too late? Magnus, queen to f7, he simply slides back, maintaining all of the attacking options in this game. Of course, there were other options. For example, queen to h5 was good, queen to f4 is also good, but in the game, queen f7 chosen by the GOAT. Now, Daniel, queen d8, he slides over with the queen now eyeing all these squares on the d file, but also the very important h4 square, where it would be defending the king side that much better. Now, Magnus, rook c3 is the move, piling up more and more pressure on the very weak f3 square. If that pawn falls, the e4 pawn may fall as well, and so would white's entire defense in this game. Now, Daniel, he sees the f3 pawn is about to fall, and he plays the only move he can to defend the pawn. That is the move king g2, beginning what is one of the most absurd king marches you will ever see in a chess game. Now, why did white not go, say, rook to f1 here? The reason he didn't do that is then bishop takes e4 wins the pawn, as the pawn on f3 would be pinned by the queen to the rook. So instead, in the game, king g2 played, defending on f3 with the king and the rook. But now, Magnus, rook c2 hits the king and forces the king back. Now, will it go back to the h1 square, or will it advance all the way to h3, continuing the king march? Well, as fate would have it, the king does go to h3, continuing the epic king march in this game. All right, Magnus, queen g7, sliding the queen over, eyeing h6, intending queen to h6, hitting the king once again, and that could be very dangerous for white here. All right, Daniel, how does he respond? What is the right idea? Well, personally, queen to h4 seems the safest to me, defending with the queen, but instead, rook g4 played in the game, eyeing h4 with the rook as well. Now here, Magnus, queen takes e5 is the move, winning the free pawn on the e5 square, and the attack continues. And of course, Magnus here, despite sacking the rook earlier in the game, he now finds himself up material, having those two bishops versus the extra rook of white. Magnus here has the material advantage, the two bishops, the ongoing attack, I mean, Daniel, what can he do in this position? All right, in the game, he continues. Rook 1 to g3, setting up some sort of mini fortress with the rooks and the kings. Of course, the rook here defends against the threat of queen takes h2 checkmate, which was being threatened by Daniel. So, rook 1 g3 blocks the attack of the queen, and now queen to b2. The queen flies down, the queen and the rook forming the battery, eyeing the h2 square. Rook takes h2 checkmate is now once again being threatened. And how will Daniel respond? Well, the best move here for white is simply rook g2, retreating and defending, a logical idea, but instead Daniel plays a very weak idea. Rook to f4. He slides the rook over, the idea being now the king has access to g4. The king march can continue, but this is simply a massive mistake. Was this a mistake by Daniel, or did he play rook f4 on purpose just to continue the king march against Magnus in this game? Comment down below if you think you know why he played this move. Personally, I think it was on purpose, just for a show of showmanship with Magnus here, but I digress. All right, Magnus in the game. He wins the free pawn on the h2 square. Rook takes h2 played in the game, and now king to g4. The king march continues. Now Magnus, technically, he has a mate in 8 moves in this position. Will he find it? He begins h5, hits the king, the right move, and the king march continues. King to g5, and now here, queen to e5, hits the king yet again and pressures both of these rooks. Magnus is just relentless in this game. All right, Daniel, he defends. Rook to f5, an absurd move, but what else can you do? It is the only legal move in this position. There's no other way to defend against the attacks. The king has literally nowhere to go. Therefore, rook f5 is the only move. Magnus, which rook do you want to take? The double rook sack by Daniel has been played. All right, Magnus, he wins the free rook on g3. Queen takes g3 is the move. The king march continues. King to f6. Have you ever seen a king march so absurd as this one right here? And Magnus does win the second rook. G takes f5, but Daniel, the king march continues. King takes e6. Magnus, queen to g6, hits the king. King to e5. F takes e4. Daniel, F takes e4 is the response, but in this position, having less time on the clock, his king being stuck on the e5 square, the king is trapped, isolated, nowhere to go. He's down material. In this position, Daniel, he simply resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Daniel in this insane blitz game played on the chess.com servers this year in 2025. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please show me some love, smash the like button. Thank you so much for doing that. And also comment down below, what are your thoughts on this game? Did you enjoy it? Did you enjoy my commentary? Did you hate my commentary? Am I talking too much? Whatever it is, let me know down below. I am reading the comments. And by the way, guys, real fast, if you are watching endless chess YouTube videos and not making any real progress with your online chess, trust me, I know the feeling and I have the solution. Go to drmikechess.com. Link is above, also down below in the pinned comment and the description for this video. It is my online chess community where I will personally show you step by step how to reach whatever chess goal you have for online chess, be it reaching 1,000, 1,500, or even 2,000 plus ELO. So many of my students are making screaming fast progress, like my student Umar, who literally gained 400 ELO in a single month once he started working with me, or my student Aiden LeBrock, who gained 200 ELO in a single month and literally won 19 out of his last 20 rated rapid games. Now myself, I'm rated about 2,000 online, but it wasn't always the case. In August 2024, I was still stuck at 1,100 ELO. I mean, I was literally doing 2 YouTube videos a day about chess, and I couldn't improve my rating. That's when I really buckled down and tried to really figure out what it actually takes to improve. And within 7 months, I went from 1,100 ELO to over 2,000 ELO on chess.com. Trust me, I made all the mistakes during the process, but I really did figure out exactly what it takes to improve very, very fast. So if you want results like these, if you want to gain 200 to 400 plus ELO in a single month like my best students, or if you want to go from 1,100 to over 2,000 ELO in just a few months like I did myself, I can teach you how to do this. Go to drmikechess.com. I'll see you there. That's all I got. And as always, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.